So today I wanted to talk a little bit about my plans for this channel in 2018. Since the start of February 2017, I've uploaded a new knitting techniques video every Tuesday. My plan is to continue these Technique Tuesday videos, but I also want to add a second video each week that will be knitting related, but not necessarily a knitting technique. So these could be things that I'm interested in knitting that maybe I don't know a lot about. It could be sharing something about myself as a knitter, as a designer, or as a teacher. It could be sharing a new pattern design that I have, or any number of other things. I have a few ideas for the next couple of months, and then we'll see how it goes. So to start off, I thought I'd give you a little bit of information about me, my background, my knitting background, and that sort of thing. And just so you know who it is who's doing these videos every Tuesday. So I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is in the upper Midwest of the United States. I've lived in the Midwest my entire life, except for 2 years when I lived overseas. So I learned to knit the first time I lived overseas when I took a year off of college. I had been in college for 5 years. I changed my major, I don't know, 3 or 4 different times. And I had a lot of credits. I had enough credits to graduate, but not enough in any specific concentration to get a degree. So I took a year off to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. I got a work permit through an international student work exchange program. So I left the United States in the spring of 1985, and I worked in London for 6 months and then stayed for another 7 months over the holidays. And then in January of 1986, I took a train from London to Liverpool, and then the ferry from Liverpool to Dublin. And then I began to look for a job. Now, when I lived in London, the situation there was that you had to have a job before you could find a place to live, because they were always worried about squatters in the apartments. So it was different. When I went to Dublin, they wanted you to have a place to live before you could get hired, because they wanted to know that they could get a hold of you on a telephone or that you had an address, that kind of thing. So when I first arrived in Dublin, I stayed at a youth hostel there, and I went to a temp agency to get registered, and they said, "Nope, sorry, you're going to have a place to live first." Well, I had the business card of these 2 Irish brothers who had a travel video company. I had met them on a beach in Greece back in September when I was on holiday, and I was planning on moving to Ireland. So they gave me their card and said, "Please call us when you get there." So I called them up, and they said, "Oh, where are you staying?" I said, "Well, I'm staying at this youth hostel," which my memory is that it was still under construction, and there was like plastic sheeting hanging from the ceilings to kind of divide the areas off. It's my memory. So it wasn't a great place to stay. And I said, "Oh, then it turns out I have to find a place to live before I can get a job." And they said, "Hold on 1 second." And so they put me on hold, and they came back in a couple minutes and said, "Our secretary, Anne, her flatmate just moved out. So she's got an empty bed for a week or so if you want to stay there while you look for a place." So I thought, okay. So I showed up at their flat. It was the first floor of a little house. There was a different flat upstairs with 2 other girls living there. But on this main floor, there were 4 girls. There's 2 sisters, Anne and Catherine. Anne was the secretary, and Catherine was a nurse. They were from County Meath. And then the 3rd girl was Winifred. We called her Winnie. And she and Anne shared a room. And so then I was going to share a room with Catherine for a week. So during that week, I had a place to live for a week. So I was able to get a temp job, which was near downtown Dublin. And it was a much smaller company. In London, a lot of the people I worked with were young and single. I had a boyfriend that I was dating there, and I had a really active social life. But this company was people that were mostly married and quite a bit older than I was. So I wasn't socializing with those people. And then because Catherine and Anne were from County Meath and Winifred was from County Roscommon, she was engaged. So every weekend, the three of them would leave and they'd go back home, and I was left alone in the flat. Now, this work program that I was on, it was temporary, so I was only going to be there 3 months, and that meant I was going to get all my tax money back. But in the meantime, I was taxed at a very high rate, and so I didn't have any money to do anything on the weekends. And so I couldn't go traveling around the Irish countryside sightseeing. And besides that, it was January. And January in Ireland, especially in Dublin anyway, which is the only place I was cold and windy and rainy. So if you were standing at a bus stop in the rain with an umbrella, you would not remain dry because the umbrella would turn inside out while you were standing there. So it wasn't ideal tourist weather anyway. So I was home alone all weekend. I'd have enough money to like go to a movie or get some takeout food or something like that. But I really didn't have any money to do anything. I wasn't having any luck meeting people through work or at home because everybody had their own lives. And so I was really bored. All I could do was sit in our little sitting room in front of the fireplace and hope there was something to watch on TV. Because I had nothing to do. So after a couple of weeks, one Sunday, Catherine and Anne and Winnie all came back home, and we were all sitting in the sitting room chatting, and Catherine pulled a knitting project out of her bag. And I was like, what is that? What are you doing? And she's like, oh, I'm making this top. It's a cotton top for summer, and it was very 80s. So it had a lot of ease to it. And it had these giant dolman, like these bat wing sleeves is what the pattern was for. She was knitting it in this kind of nubby cotton yarn, and it had little shiny bits kind of in the nubs. And it was a really interesting nubbly yarn. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to get me some of that. So I asked them, where can I buy knitting supplies? And so they said that there was a department store in downtown Dublin, not too far from where I was working, that had a knitting department. And so later that week when I got paid on Thursdays, I cashed my check and I went down to that department store and I looked through, and I bought a pattern. It was on a piece of cardstock. And I bought the yarn for it and the needles. And it was for a sleeveless V-neck top. So it was just basically a rectangle with a V-neck. And it called for the same yarn that Catherine's sweater called for. So I got that yarn, but then I thought, oh, I'm going to make mine fancy and I'm going to get some red yarn to knit the ribbing with around the armholes and the bottom and stuff. So anybody who's ever knit with red cotton yarn will know that was a horrible mistake, and it wouldn't be my last mistake, but it was my first. So I took all the stuff home, and they showed me how I had learned the knit stitch in 5th grade. One afternoon we had a special thing at school you could sign up for, and I signed up for knitting. So I learned the knit stitch, but I didn't know how to cast on. So they showed me how to do knitting on, and then I had a lot of muscle memory for the knitting, except I was wrapping the yarn in the wrong direction. So they corrected that. So all evening long I'm practicing, and I was so tense and practicing the knit stitch, but I didn't know how to purl, and I'd been studying the pattern and the instructions, so I understood what it was going to do, and I knew after I cast on I was going to have to do knit one, purl one ribbing, and I didn't know how to purl. And so Friday morning they're all getting ready to go to work, and then they would all be leaving work for home, and I wasn't going to see them again. And I said, but I don't know how to purl. And they said, oh, it's just the opposite of knitting. It's just the opposite. So I'm like, okay. And so that night I got home all alone in the flat, and I spent most of the evening doing the knit stitch and peering over the back of it to try to see what was happening so that I could figure out how to purl. And I couldn't couldn't figure it out from that for a couple of obvious reasons. Not obvious to me then, but purling isn't really the opposite of knitting. It sort of is, but not really. So I didn't know what to do. And so Saturday morning, I took a bus and went downtown to a bookstore. And I think my memory is that I had my knitting in my backpack with me. I could not afford to buy a knitting book because I'd spent all my money on the knitting. So I stood in the knitting section of the bookstore and I studied the pictures. And there were 3 little pictures, sort of like the before, like the setup, the in process, and here's what it looks like. So and there weren't pictures, they were drawings. So 3 drawings. I studied them and studied them and studied them, and then I pulled my knitting out and I, tried, so I was there for a long time. And I was there for a couple hours because I was also just looking at books, like what book am I going to buy when I have money? So but I did figure out the purl stitch while I was standing there in the bookstore, and I left. And then the next week I bought that book, which is actually right here. It was called The Knit Kit. And what was the part that I could look at in the bookstore was this part here. There's like a reference book here. And then this part that was in the front, this is kind of broken. This part was all sealed up, and what it was is 48 different patterns. Each one of them was on a separate card. So we have some very 80s looking wonderful things here. So I bought that book, and for years that was the only knitting reference book I had. Because I just followed the directions in the pattern. Most of the stuff I could figure out, and if there was something I hadn't done, whatever knitting book I was getting it out of usually had a reference section that would explain that particular thing. So this is what got me started. So other than them teaching me, I'll just leave this down for now. Other than them teaching me how to do knitting on and correcting my knit stitch, I taught myself to knit. And it didn't bother me. It also didn't occur to me to get any help. I would go, they had other little yarn shops around Dublin that I would go to. Never once did it ever occur to me to ask, do you have knitting classes? Or to walk into a shop and say, could you help me with this? Never dawned on me. And I don't even know if they would have done that in those shops, because every girl in Ireland knew how to knit. They knit in the public schools, which were run by the church, and they had knitting time. And so I don't even know if they had classes. I think it took me 5 or 6 years of going to yarn shops before for the first time I saw that they had classes, and I thought, well, that's a good idea. So, and I had taught myself to bake when I was a kid after I learned to read, and I was really interested in baking. We had a cookbook, those Better Homes and Gardens cookbooks, those red checker cookbooks. They have a lot of recipes in there, but they also have a lot of information about things like how long to boil an egg, or how to sift flour, how to measure ingredients. So I just assumed that I could learn to knit from a book as well. So that's the story of how I learned to knit. And at some point, I'll probably tell you the story about how I became a master hand knitter, what that even means. And if you have any questions about that, or questions about my knitting history or anything like that, you can leave those in the comments below. And I have a Ravelry group also called Rox, where I post information about new videos, but I also answer questions that people have, knitting questions, techniques questions. That's Herbie. So that's it for this Friday. I just received a package in the mail today that's going to set me up for what I'm going to do next Friday. At least what I'll introduce next Friday. But if you have ideas or suggestions for things you want me to do in these Friday videos, let me know, because like I said, they'll be knitting related, but they won't necessarily be knitting techniques. So let me know. Thanks for watching.